In the harsh winter of 1857, 4 women disappeared from a secluded Mormon settlement in the Utah Territory, vanishing without leaving even a single footprint in the snow. Their husband, Ezekiel Whitmore, claimed they had set off to visit relatives back east, an impossible journey during what was recorded as one of the most brutal winters the territory had ever endured. For more than 60 years, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints kept the incident locked away in restricted archives. But in 1920, during construction of a new meeting house, workers made a discovery that forced church authorities to confront one of the darkest and most unsettling episodes of their early Utah history. What was uncovered beneath the chapel's foundation shook the community's convictions about faith, family, and the sacrifices demanded to build Zion in the wilderness. Before we continue the story of Ezekiel Whitmore and the winter that changed everything, understand this: this tale is not for everyone. It is for those willing to unearth the hidden tragedies that history tried to bury. If you are ready for stories that challenge the accepted version of America's past, subscribe and turn on notifications. Tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Do you have the courage to confront the truths about the early Mormon settlements? The 1920 discovery would prove that some secrets are far too terrible to remain hidden forever. The Utah Territory in 1847 was a land where soaring hopes collided with relentless hardship. When Brigham Young first looked over the Salt Lake Valley and declared, "This is the place," he saw a barren expanse of alkaline desert hemmed in by mountains that would seal his people into isolation for months each year. Yet for the Mormon pioneers, that desolation represented divine deliverance, a sanctuary where they could live their faith without the violence and persecution that had driven them from Missouri, Illinois, and every other refuge they had sought. Ezekiel Whitmore reached the valley in late September 1847 as part of the Second Migration Group. Unlike Brigham Young's advance company, Whitmore's party faced the onset of winter with too few supplies and inadequate shelter. A 34-year-old carpenter from Vermont, Ezekiel had converted to Mormonism in 1843, after hearing Joseph Smith preach in Nauvoo. What distinguished Whitmore from most settlers was his household. He traveled with 4 wives, all legally married to him under the secretly practiced doctrine of plural marriage. His first wife, 31-year-old Sarah Whitmore, had been with him for 8 years. Calm and practical, already showing strands of gray in her hair, she was unable to bear children, a circumstance that in Mormon theology made plural marriage not merely permitted but essential for reaching the highest level of celestial glory. It was Sarah who chose Ezekiel's second wife, Rebecca Thornton, in 1845. At 27, Rebecca was unusually educated for a woman of her time, literate in both English and German. She questioned doctrine more boldly than many men would tolerate. Yet Ezekiel welcomed her sharp intellect and her participation in family discussions. The third wife, Mary Kellerman, joined the family in early 1847, just before they headed west. At 24 and carrying her first child, she endured great suffering on the journey. Her German immigrant parents had died during the Nauvoo period, leaving her with no surviving family other than the Whitmores. The youngest, Ruth Caldwell, was barely 19. She married Ezekiel only 3 months before the trek to Utah, a union arranged by church leaders who believed she needed protection after her own family perished during the Missouri conflicts. The Whitmores settled in an area that would later be called Mill Creek, roughly 8 miles southeast of the main Salt Lake community. Ezekiel selected the site because a small creek provided year-round water, and the soil appeared promising for farming. The isolation also appealed to his reserved nature. He preferred the company of his wives and his work to the obligations and scrutiny of community life. That first autumn, Ezekiel labored tirelessly to prepare for winter. He built a large log home with separate rooms for each wife, adhering to the carefully developed protocols for managing plural households. Though sturdy, with thick log walls and a stone foundation, it stood alone in the wilderness. Their nearest neighbors, a Danish family, lived 3 miles north, and once snow fell, even they would be unreachable. Early Mormon communities relied on unity and cooperation for survival. Every household depended on shared labor and mutual responsibility. Church leaders carefully monitored plural marriages, understanding both their spiritual significance and the practical difficulties of managing complex family dynamics in isolation. Men practicing polygamy were expected to maintain peace in their homes, and contribute positively to the community at large. Each of Ezekiel's wives carried essential responsibilities. Sarah oversaw domestic affairs with calm efficiency, organizing textiles and food stores for winter. Rebecca meticulously tracked supplies and finances, and had begun teaching herself basic medical skills. Despite her pregnancy, Mary excelled at preserving food and had stocked an impressive supply of dried fruits and vegetables. Ruth, youthful and energetic, took on the heaviest physical labor without complaint. By December 1847, the Whitmore household appeared prosperous and orderly. Records indicate that Ezekiel made regular trips to the main settlement for trade and church meetings. Visitors described the wives as healthy, well-kept, and unusually harmonious for a plural marriage. Bishop William Curtis visited in early December and later wrote that the family displayed remarkable unity and blessings, a model of righteous living and proper household order. Yet in his private diary, Bishop Curtis admitted a deep unease. The four women seemed unnervingly synchronized, finishing each other's sentences and moving as though guided by a single will. He also noticed identical small cuts on each woman's wrist, explained as kitchen injuries, but strangely uniform in depth and age. The winter of 1847-1848 descended with brutal force. Snow fell from mid-November through March. Temperatures dropped to 20 degrees below zero, and fierce winds could knock a man off his feet. While those in the main settlement endured hardship, families like the Whitmores, isolated and alone, faced a true test of endurance and faith. The last confirmed sighting of all four Whitmore women occurred on December 19, 1847. Hunters passing the cabin saw smoke rising from the chimney. Sarah and Rebecca greeted them at the door, accepted fresh deer meat, and politely declined an invitation to Christmas services, saying they planned to worship privately as a family. What followed would mystify investigators for decades and become one of the most haunting mysteries of early Mormon Utah. On January 8, 1848, Ezekiel appeared in the main settlement requesting a private meeting with Bishop Curtis. Witnesses described him as a man transformed, clothing disordered, beard untrimmed and eyes haunted as though he had witnessed something unbearable. In private, Ezekiel claimed that Sarah had received a divine revelation commanding her to travel east to care for a sick sister in Missouri. He insisted she had felt the call so urgently that she joined a small passing party rather than wait for spring. The bishop was immediately suspicious. No one traveled east in winter, and Sarah had never spoken of a sister in Missouri. When questioned further, Ezekiel's story shifted. First he said the travelers were missionaries returning east. Then he claimed they were mountain men with secret winter routes. His hands shook as he spoke, and he repeatedly glanced toward the door as if expecting someone or something else to enter. Most unsettling was his insistence that the bishop must not visit the cabin. He claimed the remaining wives were observing a sacred period of spiritual purification that required total isolation. Bishop Curtis recorded the conversation officially, but in his private diary he wrote of deepening alarm. He recorded in his private diary, "Brother Whitmore speaks of revelations, yet I fear he hides something far more earthly and dreadful. His demeanor suggests guilt more than sorrow, and his words defy both logic and the season." 3 weeks later, on January 30th, Ezekiel returned to the settlement with news even more troubling. He now claimed that Rebecca, too, had received a divine calling, this time instructing her to journey east to teach in a mission school. According to him, she had departed with another traveling group, taking only what she absolutely needed. When the bishop pressed him, demanding to know what travelers could possibly be passing through Utah territory in February, Ezekiel's explanation dissolved into rambling references to the mysterious workings of God and trials meant to test the faithful. Unconvinced, Bishop Curtis insisted on visiting the cabin to see the remaining wives. Ezekiel reacted with agitation, insisting that Mary and Ruth were bedridden with a contagious fever and could not receive visitors. He promised to bring them to the settlement once they recovered, but by then the bishop's suspicions were too grave to ignore. On February 3rd, Bishop Curtis assembled 5 men and set out for the Whitmore homestead. The journey through deep snow was dangerous and slow, taking most of the day despite the short distance. When they arrived, they found Ezekiel alone in the cabin, crouched beside a fire far too small to warm the place. He greeted them with strained politeness, but his story had shifted yet again. Mary and Ruth, he now claimed, had regained their health and chosen to join Sarah and Rebecca on their eastward pilgrimage. He said they left just 2 days prior, escorted by trappers who promised safe passage to civilization. When the bishop asked to examine the women's belongings, Ezekiel showed them rooms that appeared hastily stripped, clothes, books, and personal items gone, yet heavy household goods still in place. The bishop also noticed fresh earth behind the cabin, far more disturbed than needed for a root cellar expansion. Ezekiel insisted he was preparing for the next winter, and snapped sharply when one of the men remarked on the difficulty of digging frozen ground, declaring that God's work demanded perseverance no matter the hardship. The visitors remained overnight, and several later confessed to an unsettling sense of dread. The cabin felt unnaturally silent. No rustling skirts, no murmured conversation, no trace of feminine presence. Their meal consisted only of preserved foods, though fresh bread and dairy should have been available if women had been tending the household recently. Most chilling was an incident during the night. Thomas Garrett, one of the party, awoke to faint but unmistakable sounds of weeping rising from beneath the floor. The others dismissed it as wind or settling logs, but Garrett remained convinced it was human grief coming from below. The group departed the next morning with more questions than answers. In his private diary, Bishop Curtis recorded his fears that Ezekiel Whitmore may have committed acts that would bring shame upon both the faith and the community. Isolation, he wrote, could break the strongest spirits, and the burdens of plural marriage might have driven Ezekiel beyond reason. Yet the bishop faced a dilemma. The Mormon community was already watched closely by federal authorities, and rumors of violence, and especially connected to polygamy, could invite intervention that threatened the church's future. After counsel with other leaders, he resolved to quietly monitor the situation and pray that the spring thaw would reveal some peaceful explanation. Through the remainder of winter, Ezekiel continued to appear at the settlement alone, growing more gaunt and haunted each time. He said he received letters from his wives confirming their safe arrival and joyful new lives in the East, though he never produced a single one. He said they were private or had burned accidentally. Whispered talk spread among the settlers. Some believed he had sent his wives away out of poverty or household strain. Others suspected darker motives pointing to his erratic behavior and shifting stories. The truth would remain buried until spring forced the land and its secrets to thaw. When the snows melted in April 1848, Bishop Curtis finally returned to the Whitmore property for a full inspection. What he found would haunt him for life and plant a mystery that endured for more than 70 years. The cabin looked untouched for weeks. Dust coated the furniture, and the women's rooms bore signs not of ordinary departure, but of hurried scrubbing, as though someone tried to erase traces of life rather than pack them away. More disturbing were the objects left behind. Beneath a loose floorboard in Rebecca's room, the bishop discovered her cherished leather journal, filled with personal reflections since she joined Ezekiel's household. The final entry, dated December 20th, 1847, was shaky and brief. "E says we must give the ultimate sacrifice for the eternal family, but I fear his visions come from a darker place than heaven." Behind the cabin, the supposed root cellar expansion told a radically different story. The disturbed earth covered far more area than any food storage pit required, and the digging appeared gradual, layered over weeks. Among the loosened soil lay scraps of fabric matching the wives' clothing and personal effects, including Sarah's wedding ring. Near the site, the bishop found remnants of several fires arranged in a deliberate pattern. Mixed in the ashes were burned scraps of religious writing, pages not from standard Mormon texts, but ones referencing blood atonement and salvation through sacrifice, taken to frightening extremes. Inside the cabin, in the room shared by Ezekiel and Sarah, Curtis discovered a concealed compartment containing notebooks filled with Ezekiel's handwriting. They chronicled a growing fixation on what he called the principle of ultimate consecration, a belief that true celestial glory required offering up everything, even life, to God. He referenced obscure spiritual texts, convinced that his family had been chosen to perform a sacred act through extraordinary sacrifice. As pages progressed, the writing grew frantic and filled with sinister references to innocence offered willingly, and divine sealing through spilled blood. Faced with this terrible evidence, Bishop Curtis concluded that Ezekiel had likely killed his 4 wives in some deranged religious ritual. But Ezekiel had vanished entirely, lost somewhere in the vast frontier where a man could disappear forever if he wished. Efforts to locate him failed. In the end, church leaders chose to classify the entire matter as confidential, aware that public exposure of such horror, tied especially to plural marriage, could arm their enemies and bring federal intervention that might jeopardize the future of their faith. The official documents were sealed, and the few men aware of the truth were bound to complete secrecy. The Whitmore cabin was quietly dismantled, and the disturbed earth behind it was restored as if untouched. The church purchased the land and declared it unsuitable for settlement, ensuring that no one would ever stumble upon what might still be hidden there. Publicly, the 4 wives were recorded as having relocated to the eastern states, their disappearance attributed to a family decision to return to more developed regions. Yet secrets have a way of lingering, especially in small, tightly knit communities where everyone knows one another's history. Over time, whispered accounts circulated about the winter when 4 women vanished and a single man's faith appeared to lead him into horrors beyond comprehension. Some versions claimed Ezekiel was driven mad by isolation and religious fervor. Others insisted he had discovered something in that lonely valley, something ancient and terrible, and that he had paid a dreadful price to protect his family. The most unsettling rumor suggested he did not act alone. According to this telling, the wives willingly participated in the ritual that ended their lives, persuaded by Ezekiel's claims of divine purpose and convinced that their sacrifice guaranteed eternal salvation. This interpretation was more horrifying than murder. It suggested collective delusion, not individual insanity. As decades passed, the land where the Whitmore cabin once stood gained an eerie reputation. Travelers described the sensation of unseen eyes watching them as they crossed the valley, and some swore they heard women's voices drifting on the wind during winter nights. Church leaders dismissed such claims as superstition, but they only added to the sense that something unresolved lingered in that place. The mystery might have stayed buried indefinitely, if not for the church's continued expansion and the need for new meeting houses to serve growing congregations. In 1920, more than 70 years after the disappearances, leaders chose a site in the rapidly developing Mill Creek area for a new chapel. The land was selected for its ideal location and flat terrain, without any awareness of the grim history beneath it. What construction workers uncovered during the building process forced the church to confront a truth it had long buried and revealed that the winter of 1847-48 had been darker than anyone imagined. Groundbreaking for the new Mill Creek Meeting House began on a crisp October morning in 1920. The project's supervisor, Brother Samuel Morrison, had been born in the valley and grew up hearing hushed rumors about the Whitmore land, though he dismissed them as exaggerated frontier folklore. Excavation of the foundation started on October 15th, aided by steam-powered machinery that quickly broke through the rocky ground. For 2 days, nothing unusual surfaced, only the occasional rusted horseshoe or metal scrap, remnants of the land's former use as pasture. On the 3rd day, the crew struck something unexpected. 4 feet below the surface, they uncovered a stone-lined chamber, roughly 8 feet square, sealed by a heavy flat slab. When it was lifted, the workers discovered a carefully arranged set of items that resembled a burial offering. Inside were 4 neatly folded sets of women's clothing, each with a dress, undergarments, shoes, and small personal items such as combs, mirrors, and jewelry. Beside each pile rested a small leather purse containing identification papers and personal documents belonging to Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth Whitmore. The chamber's dry, stone-sealed environment had preserved everything remarkably well. Brother Morrison immediately notified Bishop Harold Stevenson, the current leader of the Mill Creek Ward. Bishop Stevenson, unaware of the old incident, nonetheless recognized the gravity of the find and contacted church headquarters in Salt Lake City. Within hours, Elder James Tanner, member of the Quorum of the 12 with access to confidential church archives, arrived to inspect the site. Elder Tanner confirmed the significance of the discovery when he examined the documents found in the chamber. Among them were letters written by each of the 4 wives, farewell messages meant for loved ones they would never see again. The letters accepted what the women described as a divine summons to eternal exaltation through ultimate sacrifice. Sarah's letter, written in her neat, deliberate script, thanked God for choosing her to participate in a sealing ordinance that would bind their family forever. Rebecca's was longer and theologically dense, citing obscure doctrines and expressing belief that the righteous shedding of innocent blood would open celestial glory to all involved. Mary's letter was the most heartbreaking. She spoke of her unborn child and her conviction that offering 2 lives would count as a doubled sacrifice before God. Ruth's was brief, filled with expressions of love and excitement for the sacred privilege of joining the eternal family through holy sacrifice. The letters left no doubt. The women had not been forced, but had gone willingly, persuaded that death was essential for eternal salvation. This revelation was, in many ways, more unsettling than murder. Ezekiel had not merely killed them. He had convinced them to embrace death as holy duty. Elder Tanner immediately halted construction and contacted the church's historical department to retrieve the sealed Whitmore files. What those records revealed deepened the tragedy and raised far more troubling questions. The files included Bishop Curtis's original unedited investigation notes, including details he had concealed even from fellow leaders. Among them was evidence implying that the Whitmore case was not an isolated event. Ezekiel's notebooks referenced correspondence with other Mormon men who claimed to receive similar revelations regarding the necessity of ultimate sacrifice within their families. Most alarming was a letter, intercepted by Bishop Curtis in 1849, addressed to Ezekiel at a remote Nevada mining camp. Signed only with the initials J.M., it spoke cryptically of the completion of the work and expressed satisfaction that the sealing had been accomplished according to the revealed pattern. It also stated that others with the same calling had fulfilled their obligations with equal devotion and faith. This letter suggested that Ezekiel was not acting alone, but was part of a secret faction within the early Mormon community, men who twisted doctrine into a belief system that demanded the sacrifice of loved ones as proof of ultimate obedience. Searching early records, Tanner's team discovered a troubling pattern. Between 1847 and 1855, at least 12 families across early settlements reported disappearances under similar circumstances. Each case involved family members, mostly women and children, whose departures were explained as divine callings to leave or to serve distant missions. In nearly all cases, the reports came from unusually devout male heads of household. When reviewed individually, the cases seemed isolated tragedies. Seen together, they revealed the shadow of a coordinated, secretive group, convinced that celestial exaltation required blood sacrifice and that obedience to what they believed was God's will justified the unthinkable. The letters revealed that this clandestine circle had constructed a complex religious philosophy to legitimize their beliefs, pulling from obscure Mormon scriptural passages and early doctrinal teachings. They viewed plural marriage not as the pinnacle of obedience, but merely as the initial step toward a higher, more demanding law, one that, in their minds, ultimately required the sacrifice of loved ones as proof of complete consecration to God. They believed themselves to be spiritual pioneers, preparing the way for a future revelation that would reveal this extreme doctrine to all devoted Latter-day Saints as the final requirement for celestial exaltation. As Elder Tanner's inquiry continued, the breadth of the conspiracy became unmistakable. Evidence pointed to the involvement of respected church figures spread throughout the Utah Territory, including individuals who had once held significant positions of authority. The group had operated with quiet precision, sharing doctrines, coordinating activities, and bolstering one another's convictions. The investigation also uncovered that church leaders had secretly discovered the sect in the mid-1850s, prompting a covert purge that stripped suspected members of influence and forced others to flee. No trace of this cleansing appeared in official records, as leaders feared public scandal and wished to deny critics ammunition against the church. Yet the discovery at Mill Creek made painfully clear that the group's reach had been far greater than anyone had believed at the time. The careful preservation of the victims' belongings implied that the perpetrators had viewed their actions as sacred rites deserving of meticulous record and reverence. Haunting questions soon consumed Elder Tanner's team. Had this extremist sect been truly eradicated in the 1850s, Or had some adherents slipped away to continue their grim mission in the remote reaches of the West? The evidence suggested that the conspiracy was larger and more organized than previously imagined, its implications extending far beyond the tragic fate of the Whitmore wives. The investigators would soon learn that the stone cache uncovered during construction was only the first fragment of what lay concealed beneath the soil, and that the winter of
1847-1848 had been far more horrific
than even the darkest whispers suggested. When Tanner's team widened the excavation beneath the Mill Creek site, their findings became increasingly chilling. The chamber containing the women's possessions was merely the upper layer of a much more elaborate burial structure, purposefully engineered to preserve what the perpetrators had clearly regarded as sacred remains. Below it, they uncovered a second, larger subterranean room carved directly into bedrock, its walls lined with precisely fitted stone. Measuring roughly 12 feet square and 6 feet deep, it featured drainage systems that had kept it perfectly dry for more than 70 years. The walls bore carved symbols combining traditional Mormon iconography with elements from other esoteric spiritual traditions. Most striking was an altered temple square and compass motif, encircled by Egyptian hieroglyphs, Masonic symbols, and images evocative of ancient sacrificial rites. The craftsmanship was skilled and deliberate, suggesting lengthy planning and deep knowledge of religious symbolism. At the chamber's center stood a stone altar hewn from local granite, its surface stained with what laboratory tests would later confirm to be human blood. 4 smaller stone platforms encircled it, each inscribed with the name of one of the Whitmore wives, Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth, along with dates corresponding to the winter of 1847-1848. Scriptural verses, carved carefully around the names, had been twisted to support the belief that ritual death could be a holy act. A passage above the central altar proclaimed, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends, and then, greater still is the love that lays down the lives of the beloved for the glory of God, and the sealing of eternal families." Yet the most devastating revelation awaited beneath the platforms. Each one concealed a burial site containing a body preserved through deliberate mummification. The 4 women had been treated with methods suggesting advanced understanding of human preservation, techniques perhaps influenced by early Mormon fascination with Egyptian culture. Their remains were remarkably intact, allowing investigators to determine their cause of death. Each woman had been killed by a single, precise stab wound to the heart, delivered with a ceremonial blade. The consistent placement and depth indicated ritual precision and practiced skill. Even more unsettling, each woman wore an ornate white ceremonial robe adorned with religious symbols and sentimental objects, implying that they had prepared themselves solemnly and willingly for the ritual. This evidence forced the investigators to confront an unbearable truth. Not only had the Whitmore women consented to their deaths, they had participated actively in a sacred ceremony they believed guaranteed their eternal salvation. Their deaths had occurred over several weeks, each sacrifice forming part of a carefully timed ritual cycle. Stone tablets found in niches around the chamber recorded the rites in painstaking detail, including the women's final words and expressions of gratitude for what they believed was a divine calling. The inscriptions repeatedly referred to a great work and a pattern, revealed from on high, indicating that these acts were part of a broader mission involving multiple families. Even more horrifying was the realization that the chamber had been engineered for ongoing use. Drainage systems, storage alcoves for ceremonial garments and tools, and preparation spaces all pointed to repeated rituals. Carved records documented at least 8 additional victims sacrificed between 1848 and 1855, members of 3 other families whose disappearances had long been explained away. The secret society had operated nearly a decade, committing ritual murder under the guise of sacred duty. Their doctrine was elaborate, their infrastructure permanent, and their conviction terrifyingly complete. Elder Tanner now faced a crisis with catastrophic implications. The evidence proved the existence of a secret cult embedded within the early church, a group responsible for systematic killings, potentially dozens of victims, all shielded by their positions of spiritual authority. Record tablets revealed lists of future targets and expansion plans, indicating an organization with far-reaching ambition and leadership distributed across multiple Utah settlements. Even more disturbing, some conspirators had held church offices, granting them access to confidential information and enabling them to identify vulnerable individuals while concealing their crimes. They had weaponized doctrine and trust, persuading their victims that death was the ultimate expression of obedience. The investigators realized they were uncovering not isolated fanaticism, but a structured conspiracy, operating at high levels within early Mormon leadership. The stakes were so severe that Elder Tanner immediately informed the church's first presidency, seeking guidance as they faced the darkest and most dangerous revelation in the faith's history. In the days ahead, a momentous decision would have to be made, one that would determine whether the truth behind the Whitmore tragedy and the vast conspiracy surrounding it would finally be exposed to the world or once again hidden to shield the church from shame and outside hostility. Yet as Elder Tanner's team continued their excavation, they began to sense that the chamber concealed even darker revelations, secrets, so grave they threatened to make the choice between transparency and silence nearly unbearable. The last stage of Elder Tanner's investigation began when the team uncovered a hidden passage, branching off from the main ritual chamber, descending to a deeper subterranean level. Narrow and masterfully disguised behind a false wall, the passage signaled that it led to the most sacred and guarded area within the entire underground structure. What awaited them below laid bare the full magnitude of the conspiracy and revealed the identities of those directing it. Though smaller than the ritual hall above, the lower chamber was constructed with even more skill and reverence. Its walls were assembled from perfectly fitted stones engraved with ornate religious iconography, and its ceiling rested on meticulously carved arches that spoke of sophisticated architectural knowledge. This was unmistakably the inner sanctum, the heart of the secret order, where its most critical councils and rites had taken place. At the chamber's center stood a stone table crafted with astonishing precision. Its surface was etched with detailed maps of the Utah territory, marking Mormon settlements and highlighting specific locations slated for the order's operations. Notations identified families in each community, especially those deemed vulnerable or ideal targets for the group's ritual purposes. The most chilling discovery was a collection of stone tablets outlining the order's full theological doctrine, a system designed to legitimize their actions. The tablets revealed that the organization had been founded and led by a man named Jeremiah Blackwood, who claimed Joseph Smith himself had given him divine instructions to establish what he called the Order of Eternal Sacrifice, ECO. Writings asserted that Blackwood had attended private meetings with Joseph Smith in Nauvoo and had taken an extreme interpretation of early teachings on eternal families and celestial marriage. He believed that the ultimate demonstration of faith required families to prove absolute devotion to God, even through sacrificing life itself to secure eternal exaltation. These tablets provided detailed criteria for selecting families for the order's rituals, devout belief, remote living conditions, and family dynamics that would draw little outside attention if members disappeared. Polygamous households were especially targeted, as their complex structures and frequent travel allowed absences to be explained away more easily. Ezekiel Whitmore was recruited during the harsh winter of 1846-1847 as the saints prepared to journey west. Blackwood had chosen him specifically for his fervent beliefs, solitary nature, and plural marriage to 4 women who lacked close ties within the Mormon community. The indoctrination process unfolded slowly and deliberately. Blackwood initially shared what he claimed were secret revelations about advanced principles of celestial marriage, gradually introducing more radical doctrines. By the time the Whitmores set out for Utah, Ezekiel had become fully converted to the order's teachings and committed to sacrificing his wives. During their first winter in the new land, the tablets further revealed that the order had established multiple cells throughout Western Mormon settlements. Each group was led by a hand-picked follower tasked with identifying future victims and performing the sacrificial rites. While each cell operated independently, they communicated through coded letters and clandestine gatherings. The Mill Creek Chamber was only one of several permanent structures created specifically for the order's ceremonies. Similar sanctuaries existed near other settlements, all built to preserve proof of their rituals for a future time when they believed their practices would be embraced as sanctioned religious ordinances. The tablets detailed The exact rites performed in the Mill Creek chamber. The ceremonies followed a strict formula devised by Blackwood, blending ancient sacrificial traditions with early Mormon temple symbolism. Each ritual spanned several days, incorporating intensive spiritual preparation, doctrinal lessons, and final ordinances believed to guarantee eternal union and the highest celestial reward. The account of the Whitmore wives' final days was recorded with horrifying clarity. The first ritual began on December 20th, 1847, when Sarah willingly entered the ceremony, convinced it would secure her family's eternal glory. The remaining wives followed over the next weeks, with the last rite involving Ruth on February 15, 1848. According to the tablets, each woman spent her final days in prayer and solemn anticipation, wholly convinced her sacrifice would open the way to celestial exaltation for her family. They wrote farewell letters, prepared burial clothing, and participated in ceremonies they believed were sacred ordinances revealed by God. Most disturbing was the revelation that not only did the women consent, but they inspired and encouraged one another to go forward. Their conversations, inscribed in detail, showed them bolstering each other's faith and expressing joy at being chosen for what they believed was a divine calling through ultimate sacrifice. The investigation also revealed the order had planned large-scale expansion. The tablets listed many more families targeted for indoctrination, along with blueprints for additional ritual sites throughout the West. The order believed their doctrine would ultimately be embraced and required for the highest degree of exaltation. Yet, the records also explained why the order collapsed by the mid-1850s. Church leaders began to notice suspicious disappearances and quietly initiated an internal investigation. Brigham Young himself led the inquiry, recognizing the existential threat the order posed to the church's survival in Utah. The church reacted swiftly and covertly. Identified members were quietly excommunicated and forced to leave the territory. Others were isolated in remote areas under close scrutiny. Ritual chambers were sealed or destroyed, and every trace of the investigation was hidden to prevent the scandal from ever reaching public knowledge. Jeremiah Blackwood vanished during the purge, reportedly fleeing to California, where he continued spreading his radical beliefs. Rumors claimed he created new order cells in mining towns and frontier settlements, though these accounts were never verified. Among the tablets was Blackwood's final proclamation to his followers, written just before he disappeared. In it, he prophesied that their practices would one day be revealed as divinely commanded and would become the ultimate test of true believers. He urged them to safeguard their records and persist, secretly, until the time came for public acceptance of the higher laws. Elder Tanner's team realized they had uncovered evidence of the most devastating internal crisis in early Mormon history, a clandestine order operating within the church's ranks, responsible for ritual murders that claimed dozens of innocent lives. The consequences for the church's reputation and the faith of its members were potentially catastrophic. The records also raised troubling questions about the church's awareness of the order's activities and whether leaders acted quickly enough to stop it. The tablets implied that some high-ranking figures had known of Blackwood's extreme doctrines before the violence escalated. Even more unsettling was the possibility that other order cells continued their rites after the crackdown, killing more victims in remote regions where their acts would remain forever concealed. The scope of the order's influence appeared far broader than church leaders had realized, hinting at implications reaching far beyond Utah. As Elder Tanner prepared his final report, he confronted an agonizing decision. The evidence proved that within the early church, a secret faction had carried out a systematic program of ritual killings, possibly claiming hundreds of lives over nearly a decade. The truth about the Order of Eternal Sacrifice threatened to unveil the darkest chapter in Mormon history, one capable of shaking the faith of millions across the world. Yet burying the evidence felt equally impossible, for doing so would condemn the victims to permanent obscurity. Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth Whitmore, along with all others who perished under the Order's rituals, deserved to have their suffering acknowledged and remembered. The ultimate choice rested with the church's highest leaders. Elder Tanner knew that whatever decision they made would shape the destiny of Mormon faith and identity for generations. influencing how the church confronted its own past long into the future. The decisive meeting took place on November 15, 1920, in the private chambers of the First Presidency. Present were President Heber J. Grant, his counselors, and the senior members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. Elder Tanner delivered a 3-hour report that one attendee would later describe as the most disturbing and sorrowful briefing in church history. The evidence was impossible to dispute. The hidden chambers, the preserved remains, and the inscribed tablets all confirmed a systematic network within early Mormon society that had carried out ritual killings of innocent people. The order of eternal sacrifice was real, and its reach had been far broader than anyone previously imagined. President Grant listened gravely, then consulted with his counselors and received unanimous agreement from the 12. A decision was made, one that would define how the church confronted this terrible history. All evidence would be secured, within the most restricted church archives, accessible only to the highest authorities. The victims would be honored in private memorials attended solely by church leadership. But the truth about the order of eternal sacrifice would never be made public. Leaders justified their choice for several reasons. Revealing it would fuel anti-Mormon hostility and could shatter the faith of countless believers. The order appeared to have been eradicated in the 1850s, meaning there was no longer a threat to safety, and exposing the victims to public scrutiny would only deepen their tragedy instead of honoring their sacrifice. The Mill Creek construction site was quietly abandoned, and the underground complex was filled with concrete and sealed forever. The stone tablets and all related artifacts were transferred to a secure vault in Salt Lake City alongside other sensitive historical documents deemed too dangerous for public release. Elder Tanner was instructed to compile a full internal report for future leaders, and he swore an oath of absolute silence. Those involved in the excavation and investigation were reassigned to distant postings and bound by strict non-disclosure agreements. To the public, the construction delays at Mill Creek were attributed to geological complications, and a new meeting house was completed 6 months later at a different location, its congregation unaware of the horrifying secret entombed nearby. However, the investigation uncovered more than past atrocities. It revealed troubling clues indicating that the order of eternal sacrifice may not have been completely eradicated in the 1850s. Several tablets referenced Western Brethren, who carried the doctrine into remote mining camps and frontier towns in California, Nevada, and Colorado, suggesting that some followers escaped church discipline and continued their practices beyond church jurisdiction. Concerned, President Grant authorized a covert inquiry to determine whether remnants of the order still operated in the West. This quiet investigation, conducted not by missionaries but by church security agents, identified at least 3 additional ritual sites active during the late 1850s and early 1860s. The most disturbing find came near Virginia City, Nevada, where investigators uncovered evidence of a ritual chamber used as recently as 1875. These discoveries indicated that certain members persisted in their practices for decades after the church crackdown, exploiting transient mining populations where disappearances rarely drew attention. The threat demanded immediate action, but pursuing it openly risked exposing the entire conspiracy and would require cooperation with federal authorities, who might use the revelation to justify renewed persecution of the church. The solution was a clandestine campaign lasting nearly 20 years. Using church resources, agents located surviving order members, gathered proof, and either persuaded them to abandon their beliefs or quietly removed them from positions enabling further harm. This covert effort successfully dismantled at least 6 remaining order cells and revealed the order's true original scale, cells in more than 15 locations across the American West, responsible for over 200 deaths between 1847 and 1875. The final cell was destroyed in 1895 when church operatives located Jeremiah Blackwood, now an elderly man living under an alias in a remote Colorado mining camp. Despite his age, Blackwood had continued preaching his extremist doctrines and had gathered a small band of followers responsible for at least a dozen ritual killings over the preceding decade. His capture and the seizure of his remaining records brought the order's operational legacy to an end, and allowed church leaders to fully understand the conspiracy for the first time. The documents revealed a larger, more organized movement than ever suspected, with links to other radical religious sects and theological currents that influenced early Mormon beliefs far beyond Utah's borders. The church's secret battle against the order of eternal sacrifice was never publicly acknowledged, and nearly all church members lived and died without ever learning of the conspiracy. The victims were honored only through private remembrance ceremonies attended by senior leaders, their names quietly inscribed into confidential memorial records that recognized their suffering while concealing the circumstances of their deaths. Elder Tanner continued serving faithfully and never revealed what he had uncovered beneath Mill Creek. He lived to the age of 93, carrying the secret until his death. In his sealed personal papers, opened only after his passing in 1963, he left a brief note referring to the most difficult investigation of my life, and offering a prayer for the souls of those who sought heavenly glory through such tragic and extreme devotion. The stone chambers beneath Mill Creek remain sealed, their contents preserved as a haunting testament to one of the most shadowed episodes in American religious history. The truth about Ezekiel Whitmore, his 4 wives, and the hundreds of other victims rests locked away in the church's most guarded archives, known only to a small circle of leaders who bear the weight of this knowledge. From time to time, modern church authorities have debated whether the moment has come to reveal the truth. Yet each generation ultimately concludes that the potential harm outweighs any good that might come from public disclosure. The victims of the order's fervent devotion remain recorded in official histories as early pioneers who departed for destinations unknown. Their true fate, hidden behind more than a century of institutional silence. Today, the Mill Creek region hosts prosperous neighborhoods, busy shopping districts, and modern chapels filled with devoted Latter-day Saint families. Few who live there realize that beneath their streets once lay chambers of ritual sacrifice, where innocent lives were surrendered in the pursuit of eternal exaltation. The truth of the winter of 1847-1848, when 4 women vanished into the wilderness, without leaving a single trace in the snow, endures as one of the most closely guarded secrets in Mormon history. Whether that truth will ever surface or remain forever buried under the weight of institutional protection and the slow erosion of time rests in the hands of future generations of church leaders. Yet the story of Ezekiel Whitmore and his 4 wives stands as a chilling testament to the terrible consequences that emerge when religious conviction is twisted into a mandate for violence, and when the yearning for celestial glory becomes a path to the destruction of innocent lives. What began as the disappearance of 4 women in an isolated Utah cabin grew into the revelation of a hidden conspiracy, one that forced the Mormon community to confront a shadowed aspect of its own past. And ultimately, the church's choice between transparency and secrecy forged its relationship with its history, continuing to shape the beliefs and decisions of leaders and members long after the events themselves faded from living memory. Even now, long after scholars believed they had uncovered the complete account of the order of eternal sacrifice, unanswered questions linger. The past has a way of whispering to those willing to listen, and the secrets of America's religious landscape are far from exhausted. Whether this truth should someday be brought fully into the light, or whether some histories are too devastating to reveal, remains an unresolved moral challenge, one that invites reflection, debate, and a measure of courage from all who dare to look into the darker corners of faith and human devotion.